All right, it looks like the trickle-in has ceased. So I'd like to welcome everyone to Science for Everyone for December. And I hope today I can teach you something that you can use in your everyday life. And the situation is like this. Have you ever been talking to someone and they say, what does your research place do anyway? And you say, well, we study the brain. And they say, well, where do you get the volunteers to let you study them? And you say, well, actually we study animals, not people. And they say, fine, like monkeys? And you say, no, like flies. And they said, you spent 10 years studying the brain of a fly? What can you possibly learn from that? And so you can give them the basic research answer. You can say, well, it's basic research and we don't really know. Or you can give them the biology answer, which is, well, actually a brain of a fly and a brain of a human are more alike than you might think, and they share a lot of characteristics. But I'm going to give you a third answer, the engineering answer, which is even simple animals do a lot of stuff better than our best gadgets. And by learning how they do it, hopefully we can import some of those capabilities into our gadgets and make them work better. And so what we're studying here, I believe, will lead almost directly to better cell phones and cameras and other gadgets that you use every day. So let's start with engineering. Why do we think this will help engineering? Well, what is engineering? If you ask somebody, give me a good example of engineering, they might tell you this. It's a smartphone. That's a good example. Or a nuclear reactor. Right? That's engineering. Or the space station, right? Definitely engineering. But engineering is the science of making things. And I would argue that actually you see more engineering in this picture than you see in any of those. And the reason I'd argue that is the engineering that goes into biology is really, really impressive. If you look, for example, at what does it take to reproduce a chip? A chip is really hard to reproduce, right? It takes factories like this. They cost billions of dollars. They're huge. Right? It's hard to do. And if you look inside, you'll see people dressed like this. Why are they dressed like this? Because any speck of dust will completely destroy the whole process. And they have to use really complicated machines, right? In some of these machines, the lens alone costs $40 million for some of these machines. And enormously complicated procedures. The procedures have thousands of steps. And if you do one of those steps out of order, the chip won't work, right? So now, let's compare that to biology reproduction, right? So in the first place, you don't need any special clothes. In fact, it may work better with no clothes at all. You don't need any complicated equipment. In fact, probably the most common use of equipment is to prevent reproduction from succeeding, right, when you don't want it to. The procedures are simple, maybe even intuitive, you might say. And so I was going to have some pictures. I couldn't find any. But the rumor is if you look on the internet, you can find pictures of this procedure. So biology does some other cool stuff too. One thing, it defends against threats that it's never seen before. That's your immune system. It self-heals, right? When's the last time you saw any technology do that? Say with your cell phone. And these things are actually such advanced engineering, we don't even call them engineering. You can't buy an engineering textbook that talks about self-repairing systems because we don't know how to do it. Now, biology also solves a lot more of what we call classic engineering problems. There's a old tradition, thousands of years old, of borrowing from biology. For example, people have always wanted to fly, right? And this is the legend of Icarus, a painting a couple hundred years old. And they thought that by copying how birds fly, they could fly themselves. Now, maybe they shouldn't have used wax as a structural element, but there's minor problems in engineering. But this idea is common. If you look around today, you'll see books like this, Biologically Inspired Systems, or Biologically Inspired Design. There's even a center for biologically inspired design at Georgia Tech. So it's a pretty common thing. And it's really useful. I'll go through a couple of my favorite examples from this. If you're as old as I am, you remember when airplanes had straight wings. They look like that. If you look nowadays, what you'll see is the wings look a lot more like the wings of birds. And that's because people studying the aerodynamics of birds have figured out that those little upturned things on the end help and that other matters are good. And you can also think of it as perhaps convergent evolution, that there's a good design for a wing, and both people have found it. But anyway, there's good biological inspiration here. Next one is lenses. This is a side view of a camera lens. You say, now why is that so complicated? Especially since our eye, right, is really simple, right? One lens, that's all it takes. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, why your eye can get away with it. But one of them is pretty simple. You see the back of your eye is curved like that? And that's something that we currently don't do. And it makes a big difference. If you look here, for example, this is a lens. It turns out trying to form an image on a flat plane like this is actually a somewhat unnatural thing to do. especially if you want all the colors to end up in the same place. So what happens is this lens here is composed of 14 elements of 10 different types of glass, and 3 of the elements are aspherical, which is technology speak for expensive. So then if you allow the focal plane to be curved like this, to borrow one trick from biology, all of a sudden you only need 9 elements, you only need 3 types of glass, and none of them are aspherical. And that's because lenses want to focus on spherical surfaces. And so this design here is maybe a half or a third the cost of this one here, just by borrowing one trick from biology. And people are actually looking at this now. This will come out probably in your next generation of cell phone cameras. It's a clever way to do that. Another example, material science. Look at things like spider webs, right? Spiders are always building these cool fibers. Here's a man-made fiber over here, which is Kevlar. But the biological fibers are still superior in a lot of ways. They can be made at room temperature. They're really stretchy. They don't lose their strength when they're stretched, et cetera. And so chemists are always studying that kind of thing to figure out better ways to build fibers. Now, this cooperation between engineering and computer science and stuff and biology works both ways. The fields are actually pretty synergistic. And you may not realize it, but right here, we actually use a whole bunch of stuff that's derived from consumer electronics to study biology. For example, here's Davi's camera. This little thingy here, it's this tiny little camera on the end of this arm that sticks into the microscope. And it takes pictures of the little samples and makes sure they're oriented right and everything inside the scope. Now, why could he get this camera? If you had to build this, if you had to ask for this camera to be built, you'd be talking millions of dollars to build this kind of camera. But they're actually pretty common. And the reason is that everyone likes to take selfies. And so what happens is the evolution of cameras has gone from things that look like this, about hand size. Then they became this. Then they became just a tiny fraction of your cell phone. And the reason they did that is people wanted to take pictures, and the consumer drove this thing. And so now we have these tiny cameras which we can put in our biology experiments basically for free, or just a few dollars each. Another example. This is Tim's probe that you stick in the brain. Now this is expensive. It was done with all cooperation of all these groups that you see on the side over here. And this replaces the older mechanical electrodes that stick in the brain. Now you ask yourself, why does this technology exist? Why can we use it for biology? And the answer is sort of interesting. And I'll run a question here to see what people think. So the question is, what's the most expensive electronic thing you own? In other words, the thing you own that has the most dollars of electronics in it. So I have three suggestions here. Don't give away the answer to those who know. Cell phone, PC, big screen TV, or other. So how many think it's their cell phone? 2 or 3. How many people think it's their PC? Fair number. How many think it's their big screen TV? A few. How many think it's other? Reasonable number. Other is, in fact, correct. That by far, the most expensive electronic thing you own is your car. It turns out that cars nowadays, 30% of the cost of a car is in the electronics. Right? 30%. That means if you buy a car for $20,000, $7,000 of that goes to engine controllers and anti-skid brakes and radios and CDs and everything else that goes in the car. And that's the technology that requires this mixed analog and digital signal stuff, which is what we use in those probes. And so really the fact that that's relatively cheap is because the demand for the technology is here. Okay? Let's look at the next one, use of virtual reality in research. Now most people think of virtual reality as something you wear with those goggles and stuff, but we actually use it in research. And the idea here is that studying the brain of an animal as it moves around is hard. You'd like the animal to be able to move and behave naturally, but studying that is really hard. And so what you do instead is you hold the animal in place, you measure how it's trying to move, and then you project in front of it as if it's actually moving. And so the animal thinks it's moving, but it's really not. And so we call this implementing the matrix for animals. And it's exactly the same, right? You think you're moving, but you're not. And I have a picture of that. It's from Jeremy. And here's the mouse. The mouse's head is fixed in place while these electrodes record from the brain. That's what you see over here. The mouse is standing on this big styrofoam sphere. As it's running, that sphere is turning and moving from side to side and everything else. As it does that, the computer calculates what it should see, which is back here, and displays that as if the mouse is actually moving. And so the mouse thinks it's moving, as far as we can tell. It doesn't know the difference. and yet we can record from it while it's doing that. Now, why does this technology exist? This technology exists because people like to play video games. Right? In the 1980s, video games looked like that, and people wanted better video games. And so the electronics industry obliged, and they built better graphics cards. There's still better graphics cards, all of which can do this kind of stuff in real time. And so this technology right here, like this kind of graphics card, wasn't intended for biologists, but in fact, it works great for us. And so we use that. So now, let's go the other way. How can biology help computer science? In computer science, the solutions don't have to be based on biology. There's lots of ways to do stuff. You don't have to do it the way the brain does it. And in fact, that's worked really well in many cases. If you want to play chess or invert a matrix or sort a list of numbers, just call a computer scientist. You'll get a way to do it. It's not like how people do it, but it works great. However, there are some problems, like vision is an example. We've been spending a half a century trying to come up with good ways to do computer vision. And we haven't got anything yet that's anywhere near as good as people or even small animals. And so in that case, it makes sense, I think, to study how the brain does it, do it that way. It's much easier to copy than invent. And so what kind of problems fall into this camp? Right? What kind of problems are the things where biology could really help us understand engineering stuff? Well, it should be something where the brain does it better than our current best technology. It should be something where we have near-term hopes of figuring out what it does. So I would rule out like consciousness or these really complicated things, self-reproduction. And we have some potential to copy it into our everyday gadgets. That's the most useful ones. And I picked out 3 problems like that. 3 problems, yeah. Okay. The first one is collective behavior. And the obvious case where we want this is self-driving cars. Right? That's the application that we want. And these insects, whoops, backwards, sorry. Help. Okay. These insects are really good at this. You know, they forage, they build nests, they defense. This is a termite mound right here. The termite down here is about 1 centimeter long. It's about that big. This tower is about 5 meters high. So this is the equivalent of humans building a skyscraper with no central direction. Just get a bunch of workers, every worker does what they think is right, and bango, you get a skyscraper, right? This is way beyond what anything that people can do. The other thing that collective behavior is really good at is it's not good at computer programs. Is there a, okay. Here's the Shibuya Scramble. This is in Tokyo, and this is where it shows that collective behavior can be very good at avoiding interactions where you don't want them, right? You watch all the people here covering from every angle, right? There's no collisions, right? It's a collision-free gas for those who are into physics. And you ask, how does that work, right? And they're not communicating with each other. It's not planned in advance. They just all miss each other completely. And I would love to try this experiment with self-driving cars, right? Take a big field, put cars on all 4 sides, no markings, and say, okay, get to the other side, but don't hit anybody, right? And see what happens. I'm sure you get these Mexican standoffs and all these other horrible things. And animals do this even in 3 dimensions, right? Look at something like birds. Now, it's true that nobody knows exactly why birds do this, but still the technology is pretty impressive, right? There's millions of them, they're scattering around, they're not hitting each other, and they're staying in formation. So collective behavior is pretty cool. Now, how does that compare to what the best humans can do? The best humans can do is pretty wretched. Right? You look at here. What's the easiest case you could imagine? You have 2 lanes. Whoops. So you have 2 lanes here, like this. And you have to decide whether you want to be in lane A or lane B. 1 bit of information. It turns out the best self-driving cars, the Teslas, can't do this. They will not change lanes without your permission. It wouldn't matter if this lane is going full speed and this one is stopped. It doesn't matter if someone's trying to merge in up here and you want to move out of their way. They just don't do any of that. Right? So they're really bad at collective behavior. So this is something we can really learn from. Let's go. All right. Next one, object recognition. This is something that people do completely instinctively. Right? You can't avoid doing it. I'll show up here a completely useless image, right? Like this. Right? But yet, the second you look at it, you see objects. You would never, you would always, for example, say, okay, that orange or pink goes with that yellow, and that's a rubber ducky. And that red goes with that brown to make a wrench. You would never put this yellow with that red, right? It's just completely instinctive. You would never do something like this. And our computer vision stuff is just terrible at this. And my favorite example, or one of them, is this. This is a very high-end camera. right? The camera is looking at what you're seeing. And yet you have to tell it, is it night or is it day? Am I looking at mountains or something close? Is what I'm looking at moving? Right? These are like the simplest decisions you could possibly imagine, and you have to tell your camera about this. It's the way we tell people from computers, because any person can do this better than practically any computer, right? That's why you have these CAPTCHAs. So this is a really simple problem in technical terms, right? There's only 26 letters. They're on a white background. There's no confusing artwork or anything, and yet people can do it easily and computers can't. So object recognition is another great thing for us to work on. Okay. Now the reason that biology is good at it is very clear. Right? This is a critical task for biology. If you look at this, for example, this is a very hard image recognition problem. Right? The snake is never the same shape twice. So here, you only see part of the snake. Part of the snake that you see is out of focus. It's obstructed in the foreground by all this grass and stuff like that. And yet, it's a problem you solve right away, and that's because this is an important problem. And so biology has put a lot of work into solving the object recognition problem because it's super critical for survival. That's why we can learn from it. Okay. And the third problem that I'll suggest is unsupervised learning. This is learning when you don't tell something, like you can teach a neural network and you say, that's a cat or that's a face or whatever, you can teach it. But how about learning when you're not explicitly teaching stuff? The human technology is really bad and animals are really good. For example, here's an animal, C. elegans, 302 neurons. That's all it's got. And this is on the chart. This is how many times you tap on the plate, and this is what percentage of the worms jump. You can see the first time you tap on the plate, almost all the worms jump. By the 10th time, hardly any of them jump. So they've learned all by themselves. You didn't tell them this is good and this is bad. They figured it out. Right? They said, okay, this is okay. And they've learned it in just 10 trials. Compare that to the best human stuff. The best one I know of is done by Google, but they did unsupervised learning. What they did is they let 16,000 computers watch 1 million YouTube videos for 3 days. They said, all right, what did you find from those videos? And one of the things they found was that many of them contained an image that looked like this, right? Which is not surprising, right? There's a lot of cat videos on the internet. But that's one of the things they found. But if it takes you 3 days to figure that out, that's probably not going to work very well if you're a biological organism. So the same thing, right? This is a problem that biology has worked very hard on, and that people are still catching up. Okay. So now, are we actually studying these kind of problems? Yes, we are. These are all problems which we're attacking at Janelia. Maybe not directly, but we'll talk about that. The first one's collective behavior. If you want to study, say, this flock of birds like this, unless you're a really sadistic professor with a huge flock of grad students, you're not going to have anyone plot the position of each bird by hand. Right? That would just be crazy. But that's exactly what Kristen is doing with her software in her lab. Right? If you watch that, here's flies. It's tracking each of them around, seeing exactly where it goes, and when they get close to each other, how they interact. And so this is exactly the first step you need to look at some of these problems like collective behavior. Then, let's look at object recognition. Well, the first thing to do is to figure out how an insect or anything else recognizes an object. Let's see how they do it. And to do that, you have to look at the circuitry of the brain. And so here's people who are looking at the circuitry of the brain. Here's Harold and Sean. And this is how they do it. They take this chunk of very dead fly, and they image it, and they etch, and they image, and they etch, and they image, and they etch. And they produce these really nice pictures that look like this. And from those pictures, people go through, and they collect all these neurons and figure out the circuit that goes behind them. And in particular, for this particular problem, there's a part of the fly brain called the lobula. And the lobula is right here in this part of the brain. And we have a really good idea that this is where the fly determines if something is an object or not. And we think that, at least, because information comes in from these sections, the lobular plate and the medulla. That's only what it sees. That's really the only input to the lobula. And what goes out to the rest of the brain are these neurons. And if you trigger one of these neurons with these fancy optogenetic techniques or something, the fly will reach out, or it'll back up, or it'll jump. Right? And so the conclusion is, somewhere in here, the fly is drawing conclusions about what it's seeing and what that means for the fly. So by studying this, right, maybe we can figure out how animals make sense of objects that they see. How about memory? Right? This is something we're also studying here. Now, a fly can learn to associate a neutral odor with a shock. And after that, the fly becomes thinks it's distasteful, and will avoid it if it can. Same, opposite for positive experience. Now, unfortunately, this is not unsupervised learning. We'd really like to study unsupervised learning. This is supervised because the fly is, we're telling the fly it's bad by giving it a shock. But at least if we can understand how this works, maybe we can figure out how the unsupervised parts works. Probably they have something in common. We don't know yet, but let's give it a try. And so Yoshi has figured out, along with many other people, sort of an overall schematic of how it works. And then people like Shinya have figured out exactly how the circuit works in the fly. The interesting part here, this is the part that does this for aversive odors here. That's that pink part. This is a little cross-section through there. This is one of these electron microscope images. And for here, Shinya has colored in every neuron that we know what type it is and where it connects to. And the interesting thing to note here is that every single one of these is colored in, right? So this is an exhaustive list of everything that's in that pink part of the brain there. And so that gives us a good idea, at least, that we're not missing something, right? That we got every part that's in there. And then other people here, Toshi, for example, and Glenn, are studying exactly how that works. They stick electrodes into that same part and watch it as the fly learns an odor, forgets an odor, and goes from there. So this is the part where we're actually learning how an animal does something. This is conditioned, like I said, not unconditioned, but still we're learning how it works. Okay, and now finally, to copy this, if we want to copy one of these things into our cell phones or our cameras or whatever, we need to understand how it works. And so that requires theorists. Right? So we got this big group of theorists here, and they're working on a diverse range of things. But one of the things we can already draw from what they've found, the first job of a theorist is to understand what you don't understand. In other words, you have to figure out what it is you're going to attack that you don't understand. And I'll talk some about that here. Okay. So this gets into the thing of linear and nonlinear systems. And there's all sorts of math about this, but we don't need the math. We can do it all by analogy, so no problem. A linear system is something like sales tax, right? It's a certain percentage. And if you have sales tax, if I know, for example, that you bought $500 worth of stuff, I know what the tax is. I don't have to know whether it was one $500 thing or five $100 things or any other combination. I can predict the tax just by knowing the sum. That's a linear system. And it always looks like a straight line on a graph, like that. And the cool thing about linear systems is that we really understand them. And so engineers love these things, right? You can hook linear systems, you can hook up in any collection of parts like this. Here's 3. Here's some more. Here's some more. You can hook them up any way you want, and we still understand the combination. In particular, we understand the effect of changes. So for example, suppose you have some little part in here, E, that's in the middle of your linear system, and you decide to change its value. Well, now you can figure out exactly what the output does. So maybe it goes down in this case, right? But the neat thing you know is if you change it by twice as much, the output will go down by exactly twice as much. That's the idea of a linear system. And so engineers love this. For example, that bridge you're seeing outside, I will absolutely guarantee you that's in the linear regime. Precisely so they can say, what happens if this beam fails? Or what happens if this beam is stronger than we expect, right? It's easy to predict. That's linear. Now, you contrast that to nonlinear systems. And here I'll give an example of this. This is the altitude. This is the distance along a Tour de France ride. And this is the altitude, right? So you can see it goes up over these hills. If it was linear, it would look like this, like a big ramp. But it doesn't. It goes up and down as it goes. Another example is pay versus athletic achievement. This is Usain Bolt, right? He's won 9 gold medals, and he makes $33 million a year in endorsements. Now, what would you get if you could run half as fast as he can? Right? Would you get 4.5 gold medals and $16 million a year? No, you would get nothing at all, right? So that's proof that this is not a linear system, right? It's very, very nonlinear. Only the best people get the money. And finally, income tax, right? There's another great example of a nonlinear system, right? If you earn a small enough amount, you don't pay any. And then the more you earn, the higher percentage you pay. And it's definitely not a straight line. Now, let's combine those together in sort of an artificial example, just to show what kind of computations we can do and what we can't do. So let's consider a Tour de France, right? You'll notice, for example, the people who finish first pay more tax than the people who finish third or fifth on the average. You say, why is that? Well, it makes sense, right? Because if you say you could reduce your time by 1:30, then you might come in 2 places higher, you earn a little bit more money, and then you pay more tax. Right? You can do all that calculation. It's just tables and stuff like that. And in a similar way, we can actually do it backwards. If somehow you knew that someone paid 10% more tax, you could conclude that they must have had 5% more income, which meant they finished 2 places better, which means they're about 1:30 faster. And this backward kind of calculation, it turns out, is the whole idea of deep learning. It's behind the idea behind deep learning, which is Facebook and Google and everyone else. They're doing exactly this. They take the output that they want, which is something that recognizes something, and they work their way backwards, and they say, what could I do earlier that would give me the answer that I want? They do this like billions and billions and billions of times. It works really well, but it's based on math and not biology. As far as we know, no biological systems actually say, if I wanted this result, what would I have to do back here, right? That's a very unbiological way of doing the calculation. And so one of the points of having these systems is so that we can figure out what happens if we fiddle with them. For example, let's say we go along here, and at the moment, our income tax at the end is 20%. What happens if we change that? Well, if we have a simple model like this, let's say we made it 21%, then we collect 5% more tax. And so now what happens if your government gets really greedy and they say, hey, let's make it 100%? In that case, we should collect 5 times as much tax, right? That would make sense if it was a straightforward system like this. But of course, any economist will tell you that's not how the system works. You have this feedback, right? That the tax rate affects the motivation of the bicyclist in the front. And so if you remember the Reagan years, for those who are old enough, you might have heard the terms Laffer curve, or you might have heard the terms voodoo economics, depends on which side of the argument you're on. But the argument is that the tax rate affects the motivation. And so what happens is if you raise the tax to 21%, they might be a little less motivated, maybe you only gain 4%. But if you raise it to 100%, then there's no reason for the guy to try very hard. The tax rate instead will go down, and you'll get nothing. Right? And that's the hallmark of these nonlinear systems, right? You do 2 changes, same sign, increase the rate once, increase the rate twice, and you get different results, right? Different in sign. That never happens with linear systems, and it always happens with nonlinear, or almost always with biological systems. And biological systems are just full of this kind of nonlinearity and feedback loop. For example, if you look at these finches from the Galapagos, say, is it better to have a big beak or a little beak? You say, well, that's complicated, right? Because a bigger beak can crack harder nuts, you can eat more stuff, and things like that. But it's harder to grow, and it's more weight to carry around. Is it on the whole, is it good or is it bad? It's really hard to tell. And that's the reason that engineers hate this kind of system, right? Because they don't know, they make a change, they don't know what's going to happen. But evolution doesn't care. That's because evolution is not trying to make only good changes. It just makes changes, right? Makes any change at all. And you see how it works. And so the fact there's no theory to predict it doesn't bother biology a bit. And so biology is full of these systems that work really well, like this object recognition, all this stuff like that. But no human engineer would ever build one like that. And that's why we need these theorists to study how they work, because hopefully we can find out the principles behind them. Right? An example, here's a biological network. This is in the very first part of the fly's brain. These are the feed-forward connections. These are the ones I said, these are the ones we understand. We understand exactly how these work. These are bidirectional connections. Our models don't really account for them very well. Then there's these sideways connections, and then there's backward connections, none of which our models understand. And so the net result is biological networks are full of the stuff which is exactly the kind we don't understand very well. And so that's one place we can really, really learn from biology. Okay, now, assuming we can learn this stuff, what's the odds that we can actually use it to build better cameras and cell phones and stuff? Is that possible? And it's not clear, right? There's a difference between software and hardware, right? Software means you could use your existing cell phone and just get it downloaded, and now it does the new stuff. And hardware means you have to buy a new cell phone if you want to get the new feature. And it's completely unclear at the moment. Biology uses these things called neurons to do all their calculation. And it's not clear right now if those things are really needed. Do you really need something that looks like a neuron to do these calculations? Or is that just what biology was able to do? Right? It's subject to all its constraints. And my personal feeling, anyway, is that they're probably not necessary. And you look at other problems that engineering has solved. Like, look at birds. Here's the problem of flying. How does the bird work, right? It flaps its wings. That's how it generates both lift and thrust. If you look at how, once we understood it, we were able to build planes that those two functions are separate. The net result is it goes 10 times faster than any bird. How about the problem of moving over level ground, right? Biology has come up with running, which is fine. But we've come up with other methods, like wheels. Net result, we can go about 10 times faster. How about thinking? Well, biology uses these neurons, right? So what's the right way to think? If we really understood how, what's the right thing to use? Well, we don't know. But my guess would be once we figure it out, it'll be 10 times faster. Right? That's pure speculation, but that's my speculation. Okay. Now, if neuron-like hardware is needed, there are groups who are studying exactly how to build this stuff. There's a group at Stanford which is trying to build analog neurons, a chip full of analog neurons. And there's a group at IBM trying to build digital neurons that talk to each other. And my personal opinion anyway, is this is a dead end, right? This is not a good strategy because you're sort of slavishly copying a system you don't understand. It's not going to help you understand how it works, and it's not going to help you improve it, right? So I don't think this is the right strategy. I think this is too early to give up on understanding and go on plain copying. Okay. Now, in terms of the different things, like the collective behavior, this is your self-driving car, right? I suspect this is almost purely software, right? So if you buy a Tesla today, and it can self-drive to some extent, once we figure out how the collective behavior should work, what's the odds that you'll be able to just get a software download versus having to go into the shop and get a new computer or something for it? And I think it's pretty clear the software can do the job. If you look at some of these social insects, like bees and stuff, and you look at the size of their brain, and you compare it, you don't have to see this calculation here, but you compare it to a modern graphics card like this. One graphics card can simulate the brain of 4 bees, more or less. And so it should be no trouble. And yeah, bees do a lot of complicated stuff, right? They go find flowers and and tell their friends where it is. So I think if we understood how this works, there's no doubt we could do it with just software updates. Our hardware is plenty good. How about better image recognition? What's the odds that your cell phone or your camera can tell whether you're taking a picture at night or during the day? Right? That's not clear, right? Because we don't know how object works in people. But here's some sort of circumstantial evidence that you might be able to get some really big improvements here. There's a game called Go, like this. And as of 2 years ago, people were convinced that it was not possible to match human performance. That to match human performance, you'd need far more computer power than we currently have. And it turns out that some teams attacked it, a team called AlphaGo, with a more biological approach using these feed-forward neural networks. And they got it to work. And once they understood the problem, it was 15,000 times faster than the previous techniques. Right? The previous techniques were doing this exhaustive search of trying to search all the space. It was hard. And the new ones would just sort of, by experience, concentrate on the solutions that were likely to be successful. And when it ended up, it was both better and 15,000 times faster. And it turns out we could have played Go very well on 30-year-old hardware if we had known how to do it. And so what that tells me is probably the same thing is going on with vision. Right? If you think of what could your cell phone do 30 years from now, right? Whatever you imagine that to be, right? It's going to be really spiffy stuff. Probably our ones today could do that if we knew how to program them. And once again, this is speculation, but I don't think it's out of line. How about learning from experience? One thing that biology does very, very different from these Google and Facebook algorithms is it learns while it's working, right? So during the time it's actually doing things, it's learning. And if you look inside, one of the techniques that biology used to do that is something called spike timing dependent plasticity. And it sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. Suppose you have some neuron here that has you doing some output, some behavior. And you have some other neuron here that represents an input to it. And while you're doing it, say the first 10 times, you notice that whenever I decide to do the behavior, a second later, this other one comes in. You say, well, that's pretty useless. I didn't need that input. It arrived after I'd already made my decision. And so you make that signal weaker. That's the first part of that curve. Conversely, if the first 10 times you try it, this signal comes in just before you make the decision, you say, aha, that's useful. That's giving me a precursor. I should make that decision. I'm going to make that signal stronger. And so we know this goes on in the brain, and we think it's one of the primary mechanisms of learning. Now, currently, our transistors in our chips, they don't do this. They don't remember at all. They behave exactly the same way from one time to the next. And so they don't exhibit this kind of learning. They can do it other ways, but not this kind. But we had a talk last year by this guy here, he's from IBM, about a technology called memristors. And memristors can, in some cases, I won't go through the details here, but they can do exactly this. You can form a huge pile of them like this. They can form a weighted sum, or sort of like a neuron does. And they can adjust while they're working. So that every time you run it, it'll adjust its strengths so that next time it does a little better job. And so now, but if this is needed, and I think it's a 50-50 kind of chance, this is something that's not in our chips now. This would have to be put in the chips later. Sorry. So this is one where probably we need new hardware. Okay. So let me close with a couple suggestions here. First, who is it who should study the brain? Right? Obviously, it's biologists. that makes sense. But engineers and computer scientists too, I believe. And the reason is, this is the golden age of neuroscience. We heard that a number of times at the 10-year symposium, right? This is exactly right, because the tools are finally getting good enough that we can understand how this stuff works, right? The tools are finally equal to the task. And the field is ripe for breakthroughs. And I think the description of a breakthrough is bigger than we think in terms of biology, right? If you think of a biology breakthrough, you think, oh, maybe I'll win a Nobel Prize. Right? But I think if we actually understand the brain, maybe instead we could win the Turing Award, which is the top award for computer science, right? Or maybe the Draper Medal, which is the top award for engineering. Or maybe come up with some application that's the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? There's all sorts of possibilities here that I think we don't look at. And so I'll give some contrary prediction here. Is we've been studying electrical engineering for 100 years. And lately there hasn't been that much new, right? The transistor was 50 years ago. The optical stuff maybe 10 years ago, but not that much that's new. We've been studying computer science for 50 years. Once again, deep learning is like the only new thing on the horizon from the last 10 years. And so I would predict that the next breakthrough in computer science is not going to come from computer science, right? That's not the place to study it. And likewise, if you want a breakthrough in electrical engineering, you shouldn't study electrical engineering, right? That's not where the breakthrough is going to come from. Instead, what you should be doing is studying the brain. And with that, I'll open it up for any questions that anyone might have. Yes.
So, for example, in drugs, sometimes we use biology that we don't understand, but we know how to use it, right? So nobody really knows how aspirin works. Is there a way to use computational power of biology without understanding all?
Okay, so the question was that we have things like drugs, which we use without understanding, right? We just know that they work. Is there a way to do that with computation? Right? Can we use it without understanding how it works? And I don't think so, because it's really hard to write a program to do something that you don't understand. Maybe somehow you could copy what the brain does without understanding it. I'm not.
Use the real brain.
Yeah, well, I guess you can do that. It's like Terminator, right? They put the brain of the guy in the robot. Yeah, maybe you could do that. Or people tried to do that in World War II. They actually trained pigeons to look out the window of airplanes and peck when they saw something, and they used them as an object detector. So yeah, you could do something like that, but I think most people would call that a kludge. And yeah, if it works, right? So it's a possibility. The questions? Sure.
I would say that a lot of classification schemes in neural networks have internal states that are not recognizable by people as to how they're actually working.
Right.
Inputs to outputs to actually find what features are being used to classify their often complex combinations of things that you and I would recognize. So in a sense, we're using things there that we don't understand.
Okay, so the comment was that the traditional deep learning networks often have internal variables and internal states that we don't understand. And I think that's absolutely right? We've trained them to give the right outputs, but we don't know how the internal guts work. And I think of that as a drawback rather than a feature. But it's certainly true, right? When these models have hundreds of thousands of variables, and they're all carefully set by showing it billions of examples. And you need billions of examples, because if you got 100,000 internal variables, if you only give it 100,000 examples, it'll just learn the examples that you gave it. And so you have to watch out for that. But it's true, we don't know how they work inside, but we can train them. I don't think that's the way forward for this quick learning stuff, but we'll see.
So how likely do you think it is that to actually achieve some of this object recognition and true mimicry of what biology can do, will we really require artificial intelligence to do that?
Okay, so the question is, would we need artificial intelligence to do some of this things like classifying objects and things like that? That's it.
To actually copy what we can do.
To copy what humans can do, maybe. But there's a lot. I mean, obviously your dog and things do a lot of object recognition, right? They know a bone from a rock from a distance without any, sort of any higher level cognitive thing. They can't do calculus or things, but they can definitely tell a dog from a rock or a burglar from a friend or things like that. And so I don't think it's required. It would probably needed to get human level performance, but to get animal level performance, I think perhaps not. Okay. Any other questions? All right, then thanks very much.